Well, focus on what you've done and for the deaf community and all of that. Okay. Okay.
Excellent.
So I'm nervous. Just saying.
There's always a first time for everything. FYI, we were all had to start somewhere. Maybe our journey was a while ago, but we all started somewhere. So we're here to support you, Ashley. And it looks like the captions are not currently working. This is Marla. I suggest that you spell the name because we may not be looking at you. If you spell the name, whether it is Dr. Jeannie Gertz, or Dr. Mario or Stephen Various versus pointing, that would be really helpful for us to know who you're referring to.
Yeah, I'm going to wait until they tell me to start so I'm assuming we're not live yet. We're all just sort of having conversations and people are watching us, just kind of hanging out.
This is Julie. Are we live streaming yet?
We do have 13 attendees with us today. What was that, Dr. Hattrick? What were you saying? Oh, that this session has been recording this whole time. Okay. Well, we've had such a lively discussion thus far.
I would agree with that. You know, I always find it fascinating how people, when they determine that they're caught online, maybe they've been caught off guard. And I said, you never know in today's technology, you can be recorded. There's cameras everywhere, so people can catch you in some random act. So you need to be on top and on your game at all times.
That is so true. We live in a very, very different kind of a time.
You think about George Orwell and his book,
Oh, yeah.
1984. We're not there anymore.
George Orwell and Fahrenheit 441.
Yeah, 451.
That's it.
Oh my God.
But really, if you think about it,
Quantables.
there's a lot of quotables, a lot that you see today that we can use, even though it's been words that are over 100 years old, centuries old.
Yeah, I would
Convincing
say
those
the
people
same thing.
we're using the same quotes. It's very timely, even though those quotes occurred over 100 years ago.
Yeah, you can say the same thing about the preservation of sign language and VEDITs. I was teaching a course about the foundations of sign language studies, and we were analyzing this, and I felt like I had seen this video like over 1,000 times, but every time I saw it, I saw something new. Every single time I saw it, it got richer and deeper and different, and everybody who watched it, this was the same experience for everyone. That's like, you just sit there and watch it, and every time you see it, it gets better and better and better and better. It's like, wait, look at this, look what he said, and this is how he did that. Oh my goodness, did you see that? Oh, and then you go out, in the world, and you look for it in the world. It's like, what happened to the sign language? I mean, I want that now, I mean,
I do.
We have seen the canary in the coal mine. We have seen what's happening to the language, So we need to look at where we came from. And then once we look at where we came from, I mean, it's really mind numbing to see this. And we know that we're just going through another cycle, and there's going to be another cycle and another cycle after that.
I was just telling Marla that Tilden, when he, at the recent conference at 1889, where there was,
The ECD? Oh,
no, it was the
again,
following year. No, yes, right, no. So in
89.
89, correct, when this was occurring in Paris,
Oh, I see, I see.
at that conference, when they were talking about the preservation of ASL and the use of it as a functional language. And so we saw is that it was a unanimous vote at that time for the acceptance of it. But the damage, unfortunately, had already been in place from Alexander Graham Bell and his total destruction. But that was something that was going to be voted at CSD at that time. But it was one
The
man.
Lantern Man. I read that in the book, The Lantern Man.
Yes, the Lantern Man. In his book. Now, is that a newer book or an older book?
I think, and Tilden was alum of California School for the Deaf at Fremont,
Right,
correct?
Berkeley. Actually, it was Berkeley at
Oh,
that time.
Berkeley. It was Berkeley.
It was Berkeley, you're right.
So the movie of Vedet's signing, the text exactly is, opposition of sign language and all of that. We would rather listen to one man who is talking, but how did he basically he was vlogging. I mean, how was he able to videotape himself? But there's not a whole lot of opportunity for people to see that even when he was there, So that was one of the things that was really striking, is the fact that we're watching this and he talked to all of these people, but not a lot of it was videoed, right? There was no technology at that time. And you have to look at it for 33 years. Well, what did he do before the camera came around? What was he doing? There was so many little details and things that come up, and the knowledge that happens in the context of that time, which is really fascinating. And so, like I said, we just watch it again and again and again. And we see that there's an arc of repetition in how language goes through its movements, right? So they went through this, they wanted to not lose ASL in 1834. 15 years ago, they found those videos from 1894. And then they looked at those, and now those are being revisited 50 years later. So yeah, it's pretty intentional.
Wow, that's
And
really
the others,
something.
in the same book I was reading, The Lantern Man.
So who wrote The Lantern Man?
Oh,
Oh,
goodness.
it's okay. Just text it to me. Yeah, because I'm interested.
The foreword was written. And so I think it was very good because it was talking about the first superintendent for the deaf, that they already had one selected. But the woman who was the founding.
So was from the
Marla
school
says, wait, are you? No, I'm talking about CSD. I'm talking first, the superintendent at CSD.
Warren Wilkinson.
At that time, they called them principals. They were not called superintendents at the schools, and moved from the New York Institute and was able to secure a lot of money to build the school in Boston. And
that
then
makes
we had
total
the
sense.
second one that was then set up where they were allowed
Same thing as
to
for
have mentoring
New Mexico
of the
School
students.
for the deaf. Same thing, New Mexico School. They created
the contribution was amazing, but we don't have this where we're discussing this in our history. And who is we when you say we? I mean the curriculum itself. The curriculum itself, it is absent in our curriculum today.
Right. And that's what I mean by disconscious autism. It's like you just keep going and keep going and keep going. Everything keeps going on. And, there's a lot of deaf people who are not doing it. Well, people are doing
Absolutely.
it. And nobody's looking at it.
Absolutely.
Sometimes, we're shooting down the possibilities based on our expectation of what people can or cannot do.
Yes.
And I think I'm glad you mentioned Vetus, because something that's always stood out to me was the work that had to be put in with children and how they use sign language, because there's so much to
No
learn there.
kidding. 110 years.
Exactly. Think about the amount of
111.
time.
We'll just give it 111.
And it's much worse today.
That's true.
The yeah,
Don't get me started. Don't get me started.
it's been a fight, You remember, Marla? I was
And
going
I'm
at
sorry,
it
Jeannie, I
with,
missed what you were saying.
I was going at it with Carla Weisenot.
I
I was blissfully not there.
Blissfully was
No,
not there.
I went off. That's a story. That's a whole story in itself. Oh my God. Oh my God. Out
I'm
of
very
my
excited to
face.
see the recent developments.
And was this person hearing?
And Alan White was a new something or other.
No, it's talking about deaf geneticism. And so for deaf, it was just completely unprofessional. And so the
I
panel
went
had
to them
two
in person.
doctors there, of course. They were doctors and they were introducing them. And then they had another woman from Gallaudet University.
Mark Meyer was there.
Do you know who
Yeah.
that was?
Yeah.
Teresa, and I
what'd you
forget
say?
his last name.
Blank Meyer Burke.
Yeah, that works at Gallaudet for 23
Yeah,
years, was
well,
introduced not by name, not
international
as a doctor, not as a
ethicist.
professor.
International ethicist and as oh my God, it just blew up. It just blew up. So like they were trying to push this under the carpet. I don't know, but they were trying to push on the carpet, and I'm like, I saw it. It was like right there. I walked right over there with an interpreter. I went off on this person. What do you think you're doing, man? Check your privilege in this space. You got no business being in this. Oh, I went off.
And what was
I
the
was so
response?
freaked out. I was so freaked out, but I did it anyway. Oh my God, I was going off on everybody. Well, I know. I apologize. He said, I know, I apologize. I'm like, well, hey, the damage is done. You did it. It's done. It's over. There's nothing you can do about it, But we need to check your privilege. You come here in this space right here. Look at where you are before you start. Oh my goodness.
It's the accountability and the ownership, owning up to his own words, right?
There was none of that.
Like I said, I was just kind of freaked out. I was young and naive, but I was motivated by my passion.
Wow.
And it's the same. It's the same experience you've had, Marla. You could speak to that. Oh, yes, we've all had that. We see that every year. So yeah, I do have one video.
Yeah. Hi, guys. Excuse me. Hello. Yes, I know what you're talking about. I know what you're talking about. Awful. Ashley's. Hello. My name is Ashley Smith, and I'm your moderator for the panel today. And I would like you all to introduce yourself. Please say your name, your where you work, and how and why you support sign language. So we can start with Jeannie Gertz. Hi, I'm Jeannie Gertz. I'm a professor for the Deaf Studies at Gallaudet University, which is where I am now. And I'm really honored and excited to be here on this panel with all of these experts. It's just quite the privilege. And the thing that I'm thinking about is, how do we get into this space? What are we trying to get to, like international sign language is signed like this, but sign language rights internationally. And I think that I'm in the field of deaf studies. I teach, I do research. I've been doing this for over 30 years. And I started teaching at CSUN in California State University in Northridge. And I became involved and got my PhD program there, did all my research there. And then as time went on, things moved around. I ended up here. I'm at Gallaudet where I teach now. And my work heretofore has been heavily invested in deaf studies and looking at oppression and autism and advocating for what it really means to be deaf-centered and bilingual, a whole adult functional bilingual individual, what kind of curriculum we need to be exposed to, what kind of experiences we need to have. This is how we create whole people. And I want to consider the wraparound of what the studies are bringing and how that affects individuals in their development. And also in the teaching in the field of deaf studies is not disassociated. It's not something that's happening in an ivory tower and coming up with ideas and handing them down to the people. I really want to focus on marginalized groups that, everybody has the right to sign language. And I will talk more about that as we go. But I'm also involved with the NAD, and I have been in the past. And that, I became very, very invested in that. And that has strongly influenced my work to date. And then ultimately, I have come around to becoming a mom. I am a parent of a deaf child. I'm so blessed. And it's even different than what I expected. And so that circles around. I'm in a living lab. I'm seeing myself fighting for sign language, and I'm seeing myself fighting for my child's experience, my child's sign language. And I would like to continue. I'm excited to continue this work.
And thank you. I am
Julie
Julie
Rima?
Rems-Samario, and I work for the California Department of Ed, but that's not originally where my journey started. 20 years ago, I was director of Deaf Hope, is a deaf agency for people who are involved in domestic violence situations. And what I noticed is that there was a huge call to action. There was a bill at that time for AB 1970. And so that bill was calling for the mental health and for abilities to establish a committee to find out what they could do to advocate and support the deaf community. So again, it was the negativity of this bill which actually gave audiologists the authority to counsel families about what communication options could be provided for their child. So the National Center for Hearing Assessment Management, which has a strong focus, there's 4 pages where it's strongly emphasizing spoken language and the use of hearing devices, with only a small marginal section on the use of American Sign Language as a tool for learning language. Instead, the emphasis was on listening spoken language, which is actually not a language. It is a particular acronym that we use for an approach. So it was at this opportunity where there was a man, he went to the floor, and I had never met him before. I come to find out that it was Dr. Carl White who approached in front of the entire Senate, because the Senate was split 50-50. We were at that time looking at newborn hearings because we did not know what was best for babies once they had been identified. What we did see is that there was this big flux of individuals who were unsure which way to vote or support. So we did have 70 of us that were in opposition and 50 that were in support of. But what happened is, because of that smaller group, what had a bigger standing with their understanding of what they presented as speech, they disregarded our concerns as deaf individuals, as people who were not valuable. And this was something that we saw the legislatures were not taking into consideration. So I left Deaf Hope as a result of this and decided my life mission would be dedicated to the 0 to 5. And I began starting up with Lead K. For those of you that are familiar with that, I'll save that later when I get to that portion. But it was that individual who told me that deaf people do not know what's best for deaf babies. I do have to thank him, because he actually changed my trajectory of my life and my advocacy, so I could show this gentleman that he is wrong. But I will save the rest for the panel today.
Thank you so much, Julie. Marla? Oh, Marla? Mol? Oh, Marla.
Yes, it's Marla. Thank you. Yes, I am Marla Hatrack. And very similar to Jeannie, I do have deaf children myself, but they're older. One is 32 and one is 30. Oh, goodness, I already forgot. But before having deaf children, I was already strongly advocating for ASL and the rights of people who are sign language users so that they could be represented as an individual. I want to have the autonomy to be able to recognize who they were. Then, having two deaf children, I began to see what ASL and English bilingualism looks like. Prior to going into kindergarten, it became very apparent to me that by having a foundation, it was critical in the development of their reading and writing literacy of English. And it wasn't maybe till I was tasked as an advocacy that I was able to see the harmful impacts of the policy, educational policy that were. I used to work at the University of California, San Diego system. If you're familiar with the Mayberry Lab, this is a lab where we can study deaf individuals and their cognitive processing of language. Later, we did a neuroimaging study, which provided us with what actually happens in our brain and how deaf babies who are late learners, not acquiring ASL till later in life, is not a pretty picture. So when people are ready to talk about this, it became a critical teaching point. When I retired, I thought, okay, what am I going to do next with my life? And then I got a bid from NAD to go back and be their educational policy consultant. And I thought, this is the work. This is where I can continue my educational advocacy and policy. So if anybody wants to work with me, my invitation is extended and open to you today.
Wow, that's cool. Thank you. So, Stephen?
Yes, hello everyone. To start off, I just want to thank you for the privilege of inviting me and allowing me to share this space with such a distinguished group of panelists. I mean, it's truly touching to even be asked. Hello everyone, my name is Stephen Farias, and I currently serve as the superintendent for the Laurent Claire National Deaf Education Demonstration Schools, which includes Kendall Demonstration Elementary School, as well as the Model Secondary School for the Deaf, MSSD, both housed at Gallaudet University's campus. I am actually, both of those are my alma maters. I previously was matriculated at both Kendall and Gallaudet University, as well as MSSD. So I identify as alum of all three institutions. And currently I'm looking at what we're doing, what we're tasked with, what our mission is, and fighting in an advocacy role for the rights of all deaf children. I would not be where I am today without access to sign language at a very young age. Over the course of my 19 years in my career, I'm just so passionate, and I would say I'm definitely a shaker. I'm one to make a ruckus about having access to sign language. It has to be there. It's non-negotiable. And really, sign language access has to be a global issue because people have to have a right to a native language, and that should be, for deaf people, a signed language. For a long time, I was a language arts teacher, and in that role, I saw the devastating impacts of an individual not being given, a deaf and hard of hearing child not being given language appropriate to their age based on their local education agency, their LEAs, just not giving them access to that language. So if they're in the public school system, sometimes they're not provided with a sign language interpreter, and they're doing the best they can with what's being provided. But by the time that they're finally placed at a sign language rich environment, they're already behind the eight ball. And so, I mean, really, but bless their hearts, they're doing everything they can to support these children who have been enrolled later. But essentially, it's an uphill climb. It's an uphill battle. And so the passion for me was to see sign language used not just as an instructional language, but truly having mastery of the curriculum, achieving comprehension, and having a native language. That's what a language proficiency, that's what I'm passionate about. And I see that is what has to happen for these children to thrive. And they don't just thrive personally, but their families thrive. And all of those things accumulated together, came together for me to see that this is really an issue that impacts the whole community. These children's parents, At the crux of all of this is language. And for us to truly elevate the community, we have to have a language available to them. And so I see what children are doing, or children are experiencing in the classroom every single day. And that's why I choose to be an advocate on their behalf.
Thank you so much, Stephen. So now we would like to speak about children who have the right to, why is the recognition of sign language as an official language important for deaf communities? Can you sign that again? Sure. So the question is, who has the right, the parents or the children, to choose sign language for their children, right? So some parents would like to put cochlear implants on their children. Do they have the right to make that decision for their children, or should it be their children's decision?
I think I have a rich perspective. I have a 9-month-old granddaughter that I can speak to on my behalf. And what I can see, and that parents are sometimes not even aware. And so what happens is the medical community becomes so aggressive and so ingrained that they want to say no at the presentation of any type of sign language, because the medical model is what is prominent. And when you lead with that model, it's too late for our children. Let me give you an example. I joined a meeting recently, and what I could see from the system is that you have a newborn baby identified through a screening. Usually that happens, our newborn infant screenings that are done in the hospital. And if they do not pass the test, they are referred then to an audiologist for an ABR. An ABR is an automatic brain response where they're determining any type of response to noise within the brain. That's how they're determining if a child has a hearing loss, whether profound, severe, or moderate. What we do see is then they're referred to the lead CADE services so that we can have them paired with early intervention services, deaf peers, and deaf mentors so that we can provide them on the right path. What I did not know, however, is that audiologists are also referring them to the Cochlear Implant Center at these ABR testings. And what is happening is that is, again, socialization of that medical model, that they are seeing that they need additional testing. And the parents are saying they don't want surgery, that they're wanting, for example, a hearing aid. They're told that they cannot afford that. So in exchange, they're given a loaner hearing aid as a way to pressurize and pull the families in to a cochlear implant surgery. So what happens is that when we are having something in that pull, and then we're finding that there's a medical condition, for example, in your aortic arteria that you're working with, that is blocking your esophagus. There was one particular child who could not eat or drink because of this medical condition, and it was blocking, and they needed to have this surgery before the age 2. Unfortunately, this medical community model did not care, because the family was saying, I cannot work with every cardiologist. And so, unfortunately, the emphasis was on the hearing, and they wanted to have the cochlear implant first before even having that medical condition of the heart. So when you go back to the question of who has the right, we really need to change the medical model, and that institution needs to be defunded first before we can actually answer the question. And I think what we need to go back is to the environment of the providers. Again, the medical providers, they do have the law that's on their side. And what, as an educational policy consultant, that's where I look at that children must, instead of naming devices, whether it's, I think we need to go and say hearing resources. And what can that mean? Instead of looking at hearing restoration through spoken language, there's only one mention of sign language, and it's not even until later that it's mentioned. So the law itself is actually supporting the medical community, and they are becoming more and more aggressive because they are aware of the rise and the support of ASL. We've seen recently many movies that are recognizing ASL and the need for it for our community. And now we have individuals who will tell me that it's impossible to get rid of an Eddie bill, and we don't want that. That would actually be my personal goal. But what I say in response to that, are we going to ban smoking? Would we do that? It could be done. We could get rid of an Eddie bill. However, because of the harmful effects that it's been, but the first law that has impacted family, actually, when it was originally initiated, when my children were born in, let me think a second, 1991 and 1994, that was
Right.
before we had
Before
the Eddie bill.
2000.
And so you're right, the law itself was passed in 2000. I'm thankful because I did not endure that. I didn't have that pressure of the medical community. I would have been able to inform them immediately. Because I was of a sound mind, it did not happen. But again, I think we need to start with the Eddie bill. That's really where we see the harmful effects that have impacted the individual child, their ability to acquire language and their family support, because families are not learning sign language as a direct result.
Right. I just would quickly like to add, I'm totally in support. And what we were talking about the first 9 months, my kids will soon be 7. So I fell into that hole myself right after the law, right? So I was really impressed with is that deaf children have the innate right to language, period, right? That is contracted by the United Nations. That is declared, right? People have the right to have the language, 1948 or something like that. After World War II, there was a lot of stuff going on, and they all got together and they included the concept of having the right to have language. So how that spun off, there's a bunch of stuff. I won't go into that, but it was already there. The problem, right, is the system supports the medical field, and the medical field ignores the people that are living their reality, right? So once that law was put in, that was basically something from the past that was carried forward. And then we are in a state now where it's very, very urgently, we need to be involved in this urgent, because they're talking about genetics and they're talking about all this other stuff they're going to be able to do, AI and all that. So, they're doing the early intervention screening. My daughter was born. They had the early screening. They did an APR test at 2 weeks old. Then they did the test again. It's important that the parents have the support that they need and the knowledge that they need, because I considered myself well informed. I'm fairly well educated, right? So when I got to this testing facility, my experience was fairly positive. I will just say, I mean, I know that I am in a real, minority compared to what most parents of deaf people experience. But my knowledge, when they came to me, they said, yeah, I'm sorry, it seems like your child has a hearing loss. And I'm like, so does this mean you're telling me that she's deaf? Blah, 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 blah. They never say the word DEAF. Ever. They're not going to say the word deaf. Yes, yes. And I'm like, deaf. Is she's deaf? Well, she cannot hear, right? So they said her hearing level is like this. So the point is, they will not, this one will not benefit from a CI. My child will not benefit from a CI. And I very quickly said, well, that's interesting. Can that be included in your report, please? They said, sure. And then the early intervention, what kind of things do they need? I'm thinking, I don't know, but it's good. To see, I wanted the early interventions. I mean, do I need it or not? But I wanted to see what they do, right? So I went through that. Oh my goodness. I'm on it just to tell you, I'm with Marla at this point. Let's get them. This is as harmful and as destructive as it can possibly get. Stephen?
Yeah, if I could just ride on the coattails of Dr. Gertz and what you were just mentioning, it really is systemic. And so that's where I find it fascinating with systemic autism, similar to systemic racism. When we think about the power that medical professionals hold, it exists, it's very real. And so for marginalized communities, research has proven that oftentimes in medical situations, those individuals from marginalized communities will adhere to whatever the doctors and the medical professionals are suggesting. There is no pushback there. So if we're talking about able-bodied families, white families, those who are more empowered to push back against the medical system, they have that, but it's not equivalent to what marginalized communities are facing. They're seeing at a much greater degree the oppression and the pressure coming from medical professionals to conform to a specific system. And so I think that that form of oppression also applies to the deaf and hard of hearing community, and it's difficult to see that happening.
Go ahead. I want to add one more thing. So the system of autism, right? I have studied autism quite extensively. The medical establishment is basically autist, okay? They create all of these different elements that support the funneling of individuals toward the CI for income purposes, right? I think we need to break that open, to see the pipeline that this law creates literally a pipeline that is not benefiting the children. It's not benefiting the families. It is benefiting the audiologists. It's benefiting the doctors, medical professionals. It's benefiting the speech therapists. That whole universe is, we're helping deaf people, but it comes back to, they have human and linguistic rights written down and recognized, and that whole pipeline just completely ignores it. Thank you. Marla?
I find the question itself fascinating. Because if you're looking at the discussion itself, you cannot compare. If you're going to do a comparison, we're looking at the need for language as opposed to the need to hear. And what you're showing and prioritizing is that hearing, my son is hard of hearing and my daughter is deaf. But if we look at language, we're on the level playing field because language is what binds us together. So if you look and start with, for myself, I grew up in a family where I had access because I had deaf parents. And when I then took my son, who was 3 months old, to his first hearing test, a very newer audiologist, while I waited for the results, I didn't, of course, have an iPad with me. This is back in the day. The audiologist comes out to tell me, your son is hard of hearing and he can function in the world. My response was like, well, really? How did she perceive me, first of all? Because I did not use my voice, except for maybe when I'm calling my animal or my dog of some kind. Does she view me as a deaf person who cannot function? And so my family, because I was looking at, I said, of course, at that point, oh, you should have punched her in the face, is what my daughter and all the individuals would say later in life. But the audacity and the concept of who is able to function and not function is determined by an individual. And they deem that the ability to hear is what gives us the right to function versus the ability to language. So we're looking at two different things. And what we're realizing is that they're wrong. When we're looking at the medical model where people are losing their autonomy and the ability for families to decide. And so maybe I'm going to call in the other panelists to help me. The intersex community where the people often are within the common areas. So if you're looking at individuals maybe who are gay, and you have individuals who are female or male, they're really trying to go at not allowing individuals to determine their own sex. They do not want the families and the parents to make that determination. They're forbidden, and I see that as an equivalent of what they're doing with cochlear implants. They're making that choice, and they're giving that choice to the parents to make that decision.
Before language.
And so I think it airs the question that I think it's not interpreter correction. I think that's not a fair question to be asking.
So the next question that I have is, how do you approach the misunderstandings related to sign language in education and in the workplace, in mainstream school? So that is causing the schools for the deaf to be reduced in size.
The press case in the Superior Court, if you read that, was gives me chills even speaking about that. I was so upset with the ruling. So a 9-year-old that moved here from Mexico, his parents seemed very intelligent, but very savvy. And so they filed a lawsuit within the United States asking to be able to move their son to the Michigan School for the Deaf, which was denied by the courts. So during their legal struggle, they brought in someone who was a signer, not an interpreter. And so sitting at the table so that their child could learn sign. And I do want to stress this happened in 2023. What was done about it was nothing. It was tolerated, it was accepted. That people have to be aware that as a community, we need to have partnerships. So we're pushing back against that type of belief that's systemic and acceptable. So we need to show that this illuminates the situation within deaf education of the travesty that we're seeing today.
Julie?
I want to talk about the word inclusion, because we see that children in special education, where they're placed in regular education classrooms. So as we talked about in the case that you were just talking about with Perez, within a deaf education program, what happened that child was in the least restrictive environment, but it wasn't considering their language access. They did not have access to education. There was no access to the discussion occurring in the classroom. And what unfortunately was happening is the special ed professionals were not listening to the deaf ed professionals. So we do need to really push back and advocate for policy change and legislative change so that we can see that the state departments like yours in California are pushing back. Because if we're not at the table, there will not be change. It is time for protests. It is time for the change because of the harmful effects that we've seen. We've sat at the table and there has not been change. So what is our next step? We have to be radical. That's just my thought that I'm throwing out there.
Go ahead, Stephen.
I agree with that. I mean, I think even myself in the role as a superintendent, we have to draw a line in the sand sometimes and just say, absolutely not. No, this is how it's going to be. There are times when if we really get into the nitty gritty of special education law, and I know I'm thinking about the specific case, but a special education case that came up last year, and we were discussing the concept of the least restrictive environment, commonly an acronym for that is LRE, and essentially what they're saying is that children undergo ahead of an IEP, they're in the education system, we're figuring out what the least restrictive environment is for them. And Tawny Holmes, who has been a longstanding advocate for the deaf community, spoke about the least restrictive environment for deaf and hard of hearing children. And they said that that is an environment that is language rich using American Sign Language. I had the ability to attend this presentation, And there was a lot of buy-in, a lot of support from the audience who were all observing this. And they understood there was a lot of people who were giving great back channeling, but great visual feedback in support of this argument. Unfortunately, the turnout was not as great as I would have hoped. But what happened was another presenter who was hearing offered a presentation on special education, and it was standing room only. It was packed to the brim. And essentially, what they were presenting was the ladder of goals here for deaf children in a least restrictive environment. So the goal would be to have disabled, being deaf and hard of hearing children in an environment without modifications. I'm thinking to myself, devoid of modifications, hold on a second. That means that our entire population would not be able to be given accommodations. That is what that's the shooting star. That's what they're really aiming for, is to have no accommodations. And at the very bottom, at the least amount of ranking, would have been this school environment, a residential program at this environment. And I'm thinking to myself immediately, no, hold on a second. This should be the exact opposite for deaf and hard of hearing children. Their least restrictive environment should be at a school where they're getting day in, day out access to rich language. Those are my immediate thoughts. And so that's where it moves me to think about where we are here at MSSD, which is Model Secondary School for the Deaf. We are the only 24/7 residential school program in the country. Other schools typically are closed. There's no educational programs on the weekends and holidays. And we understand the importance of having shared family time for these kids. That being said, at Model Secondary School for the Deaf, we have students that are from all over the country. So having them fly home to spend time with family does prove to be a challenge. But imagine the trade-off here of having consistent language exposure. It's a natural environment for them, even for students who might not have native exposure or initial exposure at the beginning of their life. We still see development of language proficiency. This is one of the things we offer here at MSSD, the Emerging Signers Program. And so we welcome deaf and hard of hearing children from across the country who have not gotten this early exposure to language. It's happening latent for them, but we still bring them in. We use sign language interpreters. We mitigate that. We facilitate language until they've developed that fluency. Sometimes one of the pieces of curriculum that we add to them is deaf studies. And then with the introduction of all these interventions, they blossom, they flourish. We plant the seed and they grow over time here at MSSD. And so it's so beautiful to see this happen in an environment like that. And we really are trying to keep up the momentum here. So the landscape, yes, it's scary. It is absolutely frightening, but we have to draw that line in the sand. It has to be drawn, it has to be thick, and we cannot back down.
So I just want to put in my 2 cents on a couple of points. So the LRE, really, we are all aware that the LRE to them means for deaf children, the most restrictive environment, right? If it's the least restrictive for everybody else, it's the most restrictive for them. And that has come up again and again and again. Maybe 20 years ago, a lawyer by the name Lawrence Siegel, who had already started saying that the least restrictive environment that you have in mind will not work for deaf children. Already started 20 years ago. This comes around again. Oh, time goes by without even attending to what deaf people are saying and what deaf experts are saying and what's actually happening with the children. So my work, I got very involved with language deprivation. And I, just basically, I will sign language deprivation like this. It is very real. It has been identified as a problem for many, many years. There's been a lot of nitpicking and button pointing, backstabbing, and all of that stuff. But this is a serious problem. Linguistic deprivation is real and it's a problem, and it has clear diagnosable issues. A child things that a child will experience if they are not given exposure to language appropriately. So, I went through doing my studies, and then we had COVID. And welcome to COVID. Everybody stays home, and I see my own daughter, right? My daughter, 2, and I'm signing, and this child has us. This child has sign language. And I start to think, what the heck is happening to all of those deaf children at home with parents who don't sign? They are, oh my God, this is triggering for me. It's alarming, right? No, 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 no. Something has to be something has to happen. And again, I feel like all of the information, all of the warnings, everything has already been said. And again and again and again, it is simply ignored. So, I talked about that a little bit before I started, but I'm teaching Introduction to Deaf Studies, right? I teach deaf studies, yes, but one of the courses I teach is Introduction to Deaf Studies. And we are analyzing the historical documentation. And one of those was survivors of Auschwitz. And they basically created a plea, that said, these hearing people who think they know everything, but really, I mean, it doesn't say the sign language slang, but they really who think they know everything and they don't know how to sign. The warning signs have been there over and over and over again. It's exactly the same thing that people are saying now, 110 years later. So we're waiting for another 110 years before we make some changes. Oh, please, no, don't make that happen. Ashley said, thank you. Go ahead.
I know you want to move on to the next question, but I do feel that it's critical we stay here for a moment. Spoken language, as we know it, is vital for people who can hear and are hard of hearing. But part of Lead K that Julie and I are involved in, one of our core tenets is the analysis of language for babies. And so what we're looking is at a 6-month mark. And so from 2021, we're seeing that babies age 3 who have a hearing loss, including those that are identified as hard of hearing, the whole premise of that is that, by having some hearing ability, they will be able to speak by using that label with the idea of good for you concept. But actually what we're seeing is that's not the case. As I mentioned, my son is hard of hearing himself. He had an interpreter starting in 5th grade. Prior to that, when he was in 3rd grade, I would check in and he was like, Mom, I don't need an interpreter. But it wasn't in 4th grade. I told him, I said, it's important that we're reading a critical mark right now that you may need an interpreter. My son, of course, at that point was like, nah, not necessary. And I'm doing my due diligence as a mother. At the end of 4th grade, he actually came up to me and he said, Mom, it's time. I need an interpreter. To which I said, okay, we will get you one starting in 5th grade. That's not an issue. And then that made me pause for a minute. And I went back to my son and I said, your determination for an interpreter, what changed? He said, Mom, I would hear something in the classroom. Maybe it was the cat, but then I couldn't hear the rest of it. And so the implication of missing the vowels or certain sounds at that point, the cat is sleeping on the bed, or the cat is eating, or the cat is throwing up, or the cat is playing on the bed. He was not getting the verbs of the entire language. And it was in that moment when he shared with me that I said, what I recognized was he, first of all, had enough language skill to be able to explain to his parents what was missing in his education because he had access to ASL. So really what I realized is that, yes, there are issues, but I don't want to overlook our children who are hard of hearing because there may be a deeper seated issue. And because of that, first of all, lack of identity, lack of a complete understanding in one language. They may not have ASL as a language, and they're also missing the gaps of the spoken language of English. So language itself is what is fundamental. It is a human right for everyone. And we are taking that away from a group of people, whether they are deaf or hard of hearing.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That's very interesting to consider. So the next question I have here is, can you talk a little bit about the deaf community's strengths and interest in supporting sign language for all people and not just the deaf community? Who's
This is
first?
Marla. I'd be
Marla,
happy
okay.
to go. Again, my daughter, who is deaf, had interpreters in her life from age 3 all the way through her schooling. And to this day, she has maybe probably 5 friends who sign. And to this day, she can still talk with me in a amazing depth vocabulary and communicate with me at will. But as far as teaching and learning language, that was never an issue because, again, if you're looking at that broad spectrum of skills applied to someone who's learning ASL, we need to have that in place. But what we're having in our country is that bilingual education instruction is something that is not advocated for. As I mentioned earlier, there has been a lot of discussion about the topic of inclusion, and that can be related to universal design and the universal design for learning, which is an approach. And we cannot use this universal design for learning unless everyone in the classroom, everyone in administration, every individual knows sign language, is fluent in that language, then we'll be able to have a universally designed environment. We don't have that currently. What we see is that people do not know how to sign. So it is not a universally designed learning environment for our children today.
Yeah, I just want to add something to that concept of the deaf gain that y'all are familiar with. So deafness is not a loss, it's a gain. Everybody benefits. Everybody wins, however you want to sign win, right? People who use spoken language are not accessible to everything if sign language is being used, right? So we should make sign language as accessible to everybody as spoken language is. And same as tactile, right? Everybody should have access. We should turn the tables and make it so that sign language is accessible to all, right? And we should create a paradox. I mean, what we've got are babies are going to try to become hearing. Everything is trying to become hearing. And we're like blocking the deaf people who sign. We're blocking deaf children. You know, they're telling babies can go ahead and learn sign language, but deaf children can't. That's like just fundamentally inherent human right to have language. Don't block us. Yeah. You have something, Stephen?
I just wanted to affirm everything that my fellow panelists have said. And also just like to shed some light that, these people, they're not rocket science. It's not rocket science,
No
right?
kidding.
Oh, we agree.
So let's figure out which of these is the more appropriate scenario. Oftentimes, once we get to this point, people don't really have a rebuttal. So we ask them, we present them with 2 different scenarios. One being that you have a deaf child who spends 3 to 5 hours a week with a speech therapist, specifically focusing on developing spoken language, sounds such as the S sound. Or, on the contrary, they could spend 3 to 5 hours a week using sign language. And that same time frame could be devoted to science, STEAM classes, robotics. And they can spend all that time learning about ASL poetry for those 3 to 5 hours. How would you prefer that child to use their time? The majority of people would say the latter. And so what we're looking at is we're defeating the purpose of learning here because they are not getting this incidental learning that their hearing peers are getting. As Marla or Dr. Hadrack had just mentioned, there's so many gaps in this child's education. So what we have to do is make sure that their learning environment has a rich amount of American Sign Language available to them. That is the best environment for deaf and hard of hearing children. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. So if we really spend so much time, we take all the time that's devoted towards developing spoken language and transform it into something else, they're going to thrive.
Julie?
Recently this spring, I was over at a deaf film festival, and there was a young woman who was there from a college student from Tucson who approached me and she said, "Do you remember me?" Of course, which I'm trying, but did not. It was very wonderful. She said, "I remember you when I was a little child, and my mom went to Family Fun Day, and you were there." This, of course, was a mainstream event back in the time, and her mother was very concerned about her daughter's mental health. And I said, "Does your mother sign?" She said, "No, I was placed in an environment without an interpreter that focused on spoken language." And at that time, um, it was about 2010. And she remembers me. Of course, I don't remember. And I said, "Are you happy?" And she immediately started crying. She said, "No, I'm not happy." And her mother was shocked. And what I didn't know is the week after that, the mom then placed her at the deaf school as a result of that pivotal conversation. And she thrived. And she never forgot that that moment and that conversation changed the course of her educational trajectory. Another one was a gentleman whose name was Mark, who was a former student of mine, who I have difficulty speaking about. But one of the last comments on the Facebook before he recently passed, there was a line that was on there that we talked about. And it was talked about that his parents did not sign. And he talked about a phrase called love code. And I thought, that's what it is. Language is love. Language is love. And I want to also emphasize Marla saying that his parents refused to learn sign language. Not that they didn't, they refused.
Right. And something I'd like to elaborate just a little bit further on, if we look at this from a professional lens, how powerful this is. But speech language pathologists, SLPs, play such a huge role in all of this, in both those stories. Because myself, as an English language arts teacher for so long, I think about partnering with speech language pathologists, having them be a part of my educational environment that I create and work with me to educate these students collaboratively. Not necessarily for them to have spoken language, but just to advocate for the acquisition of literacy skills and the like. And so I think how beautiful and powerful a collaborative approach would be. But for all those watching, I just want to encourage you to seek that collaborative approach. When your child is at a school with a deaf teacher, and a deaf educator, come at it from a lens of developing cultural identity and language first. A lens where deaf and hard of hearing children do not necessarily need to be fixed because it's not necessary. All we need is language access. From as early as age possible, having access to knowing what's going on, fund of knowledge where we know what current events are taking place. These are so critical to the development of language and identity.
Yeah, I completely support that because I'm very impressed with the SLPs who come in and help them develop very valuable skills, give them tools. There is nothing wrong with more skill and more tools to navigate life. I would like to call on everybody, I mean, not necessarily the panelists, but everybody out there who's listening to this. I would just like to call on you, call your attention to the actions of the framing, the medical framing of the value of speech and language therapy, right? So there's more and more we have to fight. Them are fighting for us, right? And there's a lot of research, maybe research from the 80s and the 90s. They started doing more research and they started finding out what the issues were. And the oral spoken language enthusiasts. They started trying to get in and divert interest or attention from what was being found in the research. And so there's been a big pull on framing how we understand things. We have the speech language issue, and then we have the speak only issue. Right. So now we're like, should we get a cochlear implant? Should we get sign language? There is no comparison, right? There is no comparison to what's going on with that. Sign language is organic, all right? Cochlear implant is mechanical. It is implanted, right? So the research is blowing up on this. We have to look at language acquisition, language deprivation, ASL, the whole thing. And what's happening over here with the mechanics, they have LSL, right? So they are trying again to create an oral system, spoken language system that will supersede American Sign Language, right? So they are not informed. And, they know that parents are emotional, and because they're emotional, they will listen to whatever that sounds like they want to hear. So it is this interference to forward progress that we see continuously over and over and over again, and which, we have no guarantees. And the cochlear implant is not going to benefit everybody. There are people it doesn't work with. We still have the need for sign language in those children. So but the framing is so paramount. Who is pushing? Who is ultimately going to be suffering from this framing? And it is the children.
You're absolutely right.
Take this into themselves and acquire it as a part of their identity, and they are not exactly right. They will never actually be right. How many more of our children do we have to lose?
That's
So
powerful.
we have to take this seriously. We just don't put it in the back of your head and just kind of think about it back there. Keep it in front. Keep it in front of your head. Make sure that you're thinking about this. This needs to be front and center all the time.
What Dr. Gertz just commented about, and the reframing, and how we need to flip the switch on the way that we view. I want to emphasize that this kind of work cannot be done in a silo or alone. It has to be done collectively,
right,
with our allies within the community. Last year, the California Commission for Accreditation, which is a state agency that is responsible for our teaching accreditations within the state, did a draft for deaf ed certification. And in this current draft, they said ASL and ALSL, listening spoken language, as a new requirement. On the particular committee was the John Tracy Clinic,
right,
which is a strong proponent for spoken language, which had a lot of information in the draft. And first of all, I want to emphasize LSL is not a language. It cannot be comparable. It is a method. It is a method that cannot be used, which was endorsed and created by Alexander Graham Bell. So with CEAC and Lead K, the organization that we have, that is an organization within the state of California where we are responding in an open format to the draft proposed. And we are, again, Marla has been participating with that in our reply, because again, LSL is a method, it is not a language. And instead of LSA, what we are looking at, which passed within that, we want ASL only. And instead, we want the equivalency of ASL in the English, because that's where our instruction occurs. We already have the law in place for Lead K. What we're looking at is having and removal of the language of LSL, which again is a method, but replacing that with English. We have been heard. I have been marked as a troublemaker quite frequently I did a recent webinar where I said that LSL is not a language. There is research which shows that. And those watching the webinar were those from Alexander Graham Bell. And so we had those individuals who then wrote a letter and filed a complaint against me in response to the California Department of Education. Luckily, I have support behind me. But again, that's why I want to come back to this work cannot be done alone in a silo. We need a strong contingency, and that is the community.
Exactly.
And that's where I'm leaving it.
Okay, so we have 10 minutes left. This is the last question. I appreciate all of your experience. So, how can we as a community support sign language rights and become as a larger supportive community?
To answer your question, I think that we need to avoid complacency at all costs. At all costs. I mean, you can sit back and watch this happen, but it's not going away. As Dr. Gertz mentioned, this was mentioned by Veditz many years ago, and it's not going away anytime soon. This is a pervasive challenge that we're seeing, and ultimately this comes down to funding, right? So AG Bell, Alexander Graham Bell, is in one camp, and in that camp they have many medical professionals, as Dr. Gertz also mentioned. Their funding is endless at this point, and so what we need to do is phrase this as a human rights issue. And then also at the table sits those business professionals, because this does come down to a business issue as well. But what needs to happen is that people need to maintain a sense of awareness and keep abreast of current events and what's happening. What bills are on the floor? What's happening that we're not even aware of? So being apprised of current events and things that are happening, show up to those events, be there and push back. Draw that line in the sand, as I mentioned before, because this is not something that needs to be happening for our deaf children, hard of hearing children. Bilingual instruction is also a crucial matter, because it is the only way. We've seen the light at the end of the tunnel. We have seen the research that substantiates this, and we need to continue fighting for it.
I want to add on to what Stephen is talking about. When we see that call to action, what that means, like when anytime there is a call to action, does it require you to have an outstanding knowledge and understanding, is not necessarily there, because we had the Lead K bill passed unanimously from both parts of the House. And it was a bipartisan support bill. And the reason for that, I think, is because we had ASL instructors who were asking their students to submit. There were postcards that were opposing the bill and in support of Lead 2K. And so what we saw was the community rallying behind of what they could do and keeping that eye present and in front of the legislature so that they were aware. So it's not a political issue, it's a community issue of how we can be involved. It could be sending a letter, it could be sending a postcard, it could be physically walking down, or an email of some kind. But when you are in touch with our legislatures, I see that that's a very effective tool. And that's one way that we can do our call to action as we were called upon by Stephen today.
So I also would like to say that for all of you in the audience here today, this is an example of how you, and I believe there are also watching parties, so there are a bunch of people watching. This is a really, really good example of how you can continue to keep yourselves informed and engaged, know what's going on, think about getting involved, figure out what you can do to do what's right. Understand your own principles, your understanding of what is right and what is just. So look at it as a social justice issue, right? Lead K, and also last year, 2 years ago, something like that, there was Laura won the right to have bilingual education, right? This is a basic fundamental thing. We need to keep ourselves informed, and we need to keep up with the current research. And we, especially today, we need to understand our country's politics, because we are so polarized. There are people in the medical field that are riding on the polarized state of our politics, right? And it is very offensive not defensive, right? We need to be ready to defend our rights when they are being taken from us. And, you know, it's been something that I've thought about for a long time. Is one person retired after many, many, many years of groundbreaking research. This person retired last year. So there will forever be recognized in history. The human brain does not discriminate. Well, discriminate not, does not know the difference between hands and speech. People do, right? So everything that happens in people, all of those opinions come from emotional context. It's all from your emotional. I have my thing. I want to keep my thing. I want my thing to be comfortable and not changing. And, you know, I think I'm one of the people who I'm going to take the risk, and I'm going to say this, but very often, based on what I have seen, okay, is the ignorance, the continuous ignorance breeds humility, right? This causes us, humanity, to make stupid choices. We have stupid judgments. We have stupid choices. I mean, I don't want to be insulting. I don't want to go off on the far side, but the more we continue to not look, the more we, continue to be quiet and step back and let things go, the more ignorant people are going to be stepping up. They're going to be stepping up, and they're going to be saying stuff, and they're going to be doing stuff because, that's just what they do. Julie?
I'd like to end with 3 call to actions for everyone. Be willing to be uncomfortable. Many people have said to me, "Oh, you're so good when you speak to legislatures or you speak on policy." But it wasn't till that bill that I mentioned that was pivotal in my career. I did not know how to approach, but I was willing to be uncomfortable and learn. You do have to learn with a curve. And while I was in there, I learned not to become too comfortable. I had to push myself to be uncomfortable so that I could see and address the system itself. And that leads me to my second point, is the system does know who the gatekeepers are. The system identifies the gatekeepers for us. They are the players in the room. So as I mentioned, Carl White, who was involved in the very beginning with the Eddy bill being passed and speaking before the legislators. The gatekeepers, their faces are present, and we need to be meeting with them. You need to study them. You need to know who they are. And that's what I did in my approach. Even though I was not friends with, I knew who I needed to study. And that led to my third, which may be hard, and I might make some of you uncomfortable, is I had to use that anger, that fire in my belly that I had, to give me the energy to take on the system, because the system needs to be taken on. Because as I mentioned, my granddaughter at the very beginning, her mother can hear, but it was 2 hours that I was with her while she was in a meeting with the medical professional, and was told at the beginning, your daughter, if you refuse to get this cochlear implant, will never learn how to speak, will never have access to language. And it was that detrimental decision from the doctor which gave that fire within me. When the doctor spoke to the mother and said, I want my daughter to be like my mother, her grandmother, who can sign and is fluent in a language. And do you know what this doctor's response was? That, oh, I know who Julie is. Because again, I knew the system. We had worked together. I know my gatekeepers. I know the history. And said, oh, speech is not her strength. The doctor used my speech as a reason for using it as persuasion to convince my daughter to give my granddaughter a cochlear implant. So again, that fire, whatever it may be in your circumstance, be uncomfortable. Know the gatekeepers in the room, and then have that fire within you and let it be your light.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we're about done.
And if could
So
I say one
go
last
ahead.
closing remark as well? Yeah, no, something I just want to make sure that people will take away from this conversation is I look at my role models, such as Dr. Carolyn McCaskill, who has been a professor at Gallaudet University for many decades. One of her sayings is that sign language is not just for communication. Sign language is about connection. Sign language is also about culture. It is a way that we form our identity. And I just felt that those words were resounding and that it's what makes us human is our innate need to connect and feel that we belong. It's that sense of belonging that makes us human. And so when we think about deaf children and even ourselves, sign language is it. That's the key. That is what breeds belonging. And so that's what I want to leave this audience with today.
Sign language
Yes.
for all.
Yes, language
Yes.
for all.
Thank you,
Thank
Ashley,
you
so
all.
much for today.
Thank you all, panel, for your being here. Oh, I see little hearts. Little
Oh, I
hearts
see
are
the hearts.
bouncing.
That's so great. I love
Oh,
that. I've never seen that. Wonderful.
yeah, that must be a new feature on Zoom. All right. I feel the love. Panelists, just know that if you ever need to pull me in to advocate on your behalf, you
Oh,
can
I love
call
it.
on me. I will show up.
Absolutely will.
And
Reach
you
out
know
to
I
me
will.
anytime. Please don't hesitate.
Kindle parent. I'm a Kindle parent.
Absolutely.
So where can we find you? How do I find you?
So you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm growing my fan base on LinkedIn.
I'll
Actually,
help you.
Dr. Gertz, you can reach me via Dr. Gertz anytime. All right. You as
Bye-bye.
well. All right. Bye-bye.